On. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending ACEEE's Energy Efficiency and Climate Policy Forum. This session is going to be on industrial decarbonization. My name is Neil Elliott. I am the Director Emeritus at ACEEE, and I will be moderating your session today. Before I begin, I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping. For those of you who haven't gotten familiar with the On24 platform, the screen is completely customizable, and each area can be minimized or maximized for easy viewing. In the bottom right-hand corner of each window, if you don't see something that you're looking for, a window, they are down at the bottom of the window at the On24 application. On there, you will see a number of useful widgets, including the presenters' full bios and a resource list to download materials from today's webcast. I would ask that everybody please hold your questions for the presenters until we transition over to the Zoom platform for the Q&A session. It will be a full half hour, and that will start promptly at 1:30. A couple of things also, to get to the Zoom, there are a couple of buttons. You'll see a Zoom button on the toolbar in On24. There's also a link to Zoom in the resource window that's available. Just noting, if you have not recently updated your Zoom, please consider doing that before we start the Q&A. There are some new features that have been enabled that will help things. A recording of this webcast will be made available, and you will receive a link to the video of this webcast in a couple of days. And last, next time or sometime next week, you will receive an email with a survey, a few questions about the forum we'd put and taking a few minutes. We take the feedback on our events very seriously, and we've gotten better about doing these online events, but it's certainly a new and challenging environment for us to operate our conferences in. So to start with, this session, as I mentioned a moment ago, is on industrial decarbonization. I'll make a few opening remarks, then turn it over to Abigail Rajetsky with the professional staff at the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Then we'll get some remarks from Tom Dower, who's Director of Government Relations at ArcelorMittal. And then finally, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Director of Climate and Energy Programs at Third Way, will make some remarks. All of these people have been part of a working group that's been operating now for, I guess, over a year now, looking at policies and opportunities for industrial decarbonization. All of us had the opportunity to provide input to Abigail, and that's reflected in the Select Committee's climate report that came out in late spring. So just as a sort of a concept of the purpose and format, the purpose is really to frame the need for policies to support decarbonization of the industrial sector to stabilize climate. We want to identify what possible policies and programs are needed to support the achieving a decarbonization by mid-century, as the Select Committee is characterized. But we also want to be fair in terms of there are challenges to achieving an audacious goal like decarbonization. So we'll have some introductory presentations. If we have time, I'd like to take a couple of discussions among the panelists, and then we'll move to Q&A in the Zoom meeting room and ask that you then put your comments into the Zoom chat when we get over there. What's the need for industrial decarbonization? Well, Industry accounts for more than a quarter of U.S. GHG emissions. And as a result, we cannot achieve climate stabilization without dramatically reducing the sector greenhouse gas emissions. The goal is to achieve net zero sector emissions by mid-century while reducing emissions in other sectors of the economy through steps that the industrial sector can take. The industrial sector is very complex and interconnected, with companies producing products that are demanded by society. We need to consider both the process emissions and the climate impacts of the products purchased by society, both embodied in the products and the impacts during the use of the products out there. So the embodied energy, say, in a car, as well as the energy required to operate the car. Transformation needs to address both aspects of the emission, change how we manufacture as well as what we manufacture. The transformation will require massive investments in knowledge and industrial infrastructure. So this is not a modest task. It's a 3-decade challenge that we're faced with. So what are the needs for decarbonization policy? What can we think of as framework? Well, there are immediate steps that we can take to reduce carbon emissions using existing technologies. We need at the same time to begin to build knowledge infrastructure to guide future policies and investments, and a concerted and sustained research effort to identify new technologies, processes, and products that will dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We also need to support the industrial firms in making those investments that will be required to achieve this goal, and at the same time address the impacts of the transformation on workers in the communities where they live. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rajecki and have her talk a little bit about how do we rebuild industry for a global climate leadership. Abigail?
Thanks so much, Neil, and thank you to ACEEE for inviting me to participate in this panel. As Neil mentioned, my name is Abigail Rajecki, and I work for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We released our Solving the Climate Crisis report at the end of June of this year, which is a congressional action plan for really how we address the climate crisis, both from an emissions mitigation point of view, as well as adaptation and resilience. And one of the sections that I was able to really lead on for the report is on the industrial sector and how we address industrial emissions. So that's what I will be focusing on today. But there are many other recommendations in the report. So I would encourage all of you, if you haven't already seen it, to go to climatecrisis.house.gov and check out the full report. So first, we start by thinking about some of the key decarbonization approaches that we think are going to be necessary to really decarbonize industry. And again, as Neil mentioned, all of these approaches, as well as the recommendations that I'm going to lay out in my presentation, resulted from many stakeholder meetings that we had with ACEEE, as well as my fellow panelists and many, many other groups out there. And so thank you again to all of you for being part of this process. So some of the key approaches that we are taking a look at: first, energy efficiency, of course, is going to be important and already has been. So continuing to make sure that we improve on efficiency as much as we can. But then also starting to think about electrification and general fuel switching to lower carbon fuels, which is going to be a big part of reducing some of those emissions related to industrial heat that's necessary for a lot of these processes. Then for some areas where maybe it's difficult to reduce emissions, especially if it's a process and not necessarily energy related, then carbon capture, utilization, and storage may be a technology that we'll need to ramp up as well to address those emissions. Then looking at clean, low emission hydrogen as another key piece that could be applied to various industrial subsectors. And then also thinking about a circular economy. So whether that's materials efficiency, better recycling and materials use overall. So making sure that materials efficiency approach is also part of the picture in how we help address these emissions. So now I'm going to start discussing some of the key recommendations that we made in the report related to the industrial sector in kind of 4 major buckets. And a lot of this Neil kind of laid out in his framework as well. So the first bucket that we include is innovation and commercialization. So really thinking about what are the RD&D kind of funding programs that we're going to need to really continue to develop the technologies that we're going to need to decarbonize the sector and make sure that they get commercialized and deployed at scale. So one of the key recommendations we have here is establishing a new Assistant Secretary of Manufacturing and Industry at the Department of Energy. So right now, a lot of the Department of Energy's work in this sector is in the Advanced Manufacturing Office, which is in the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy under that EERE. So we think to really focus what we need to do to reduce emissions from this sector, we actually need to pull that AMO out of EERE, make it its own Assistant Secretary level office at the DOE. And then along with that, we need to continue increasing the investment that we're spending on R&D in this area, as well as making sure that we expand or establish key DOE programs in all of the areas that I just mentioned. And then beyond the kind of pure R&D piece, we also need to support demonstration and commercialization. So in the Select Committee report, we also have a separate section just on kind of innovation policy that applies across the board to all the various sectors. So we want to make sure that all of those innovation policies and programs also apply to the industrial sector and the things that we're going to need to do where it's especially important. Things like regional partnerships and consortia, large-scale demonstration funding, which is really going to be needed to have the kind of first commercial large-scale applications of these new technologies at industrial facilities. Things like a DOE foundation could help with these efforts, as well as expanding Manufacturing USA and creating more institutes to help bring these technologies to manufacturers. Then the second bucket that we have is financial support. So we have R&D, we're developing these technologies, we're helping to demonstrate and commercialize them, but we also need to help support our manufacturers and other industrial facilities to really get these technologies out and deployed as much as possible. And some of the areas that we recommend here is establishing a revolving loan fund specifically for manufacturers and industrial facilities to undertake some of these upgrades or new process technologies, put those in place. This could include also tax incentives, so existing ones for industrial efficiency as well as carbon capture, new ones like hydrogen, and bringing back some like clean domestic manufacturing. And then there's a host of other financial mechanisms that can be applied to various sectors. But again, we want to make sure that they're applicable to industrial emissions technologies as well. And there are some listed here. Then the third bucket is physical and knowledge infrastructure. So we want companies and businesses to, upgrade their facilities, but we also need to make sure the infrastructure is in place to actually enable all of that to happen. So developing physical infrastructure for things like materials recovery and recycling, large-scale carbon storage to facilitate carbon capture, as well as hubs for low and zero-emission hydrogen. Then on the knowledge infrastructure side, which Neil also mentioned, we think about this both as the data that we're going to need to be able to differentiate between industrial products. If we're developing technologies for lower emission cement, lower emission steel, we want to make sure the data is out there so people can actually make decisions on those purchases. And then the other piece of the knowledge infrastructure here is making sure that we have the workforce of the future that industry is going to need to take on all of these technologies. And then the last bucket is markets and standards to really pull these technologies into the market and set up these markets to kind of bring more of them online. So here, one of our main ones is a federal procurement by clean program, similar to what California is already starting to do. So using federal dollars to procure some of that low emissions materials like cement and steel, then bringing this beyond just federal procurement to using tradable performance-based standards with a border adjustment mechanism. To broaden that throughout industry, and then thinking about other standards as well that you can see in that last bullet there. And then finally, I just wanted to mention our report lists all these recommendations. Some of them, there are already existing pieces of legislation. Sometimes there's still gaps, but I did want to mention that many of our recommendations are already part of existing bills that are out there in the 116th that we hopefully maybe we'll see some of them pass in the next week or so, we'll see, but if not, we expect to see them carry on to the 117th. And some of the key legislation here is the Clean Industrial Technology Act, which really gets at that R&D need for industrial decarbonization. Also the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act, which hits a lot of the efficiency pieces that will be important. Then, as Congressman Tonko mentioned in his keynote, the ENC Committee's Clean Future Act discussion draft includes a lot of the pieces that we think about and recommend in the Select Committee report. The Green Act out of Ways and Means has a lot of the tax credits that we're going to need. And then, of course, there are two large House packages that have been passed that we're hoping to see move forward. The Moving Forward Act, the Infrastructure Package, which has a lot of our recommendations, as well as the Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act Energy Package, which has a lot of the innovation recommendations as well. So looking forward, one of the things that we're currently watching now is the Senate and House Energy Bill Conference. So I know my colleagues have been working very hard negotiating on that. So I think we're hopeful that maybe something will come out of it. And I think more than 50 of the Select Committee recommendations were in the House passed version. So it would be really great to see some of those go through and get passed into law. Then, of course, looking into the 117th, we're expecting stimulus investments, which we can certainly direct to this sector to kind of help things get started. By clean procurement, which I mentioned, as well as Congressman Tonko being another key area that there is continued work on in the ENC committee. Then, of course, whether or not we get the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, it's going to be very close margins in both the House and the Senate. So I think bipartisan measures are going to be something that people are going to look to, and innovation is one that has always had bipartisan support, and a lot of innovation is still needed in this sector. So I think that's an area to look at, as well as executive action and what the administration can do without Congress. But I think Ryan's going to talk a little bit more on that front. So I will just wrap there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Please, again, remember, we will be taking questions for the panelists in the Zoom session. I'm going to turn it over now to Tom Dower with ArcelorMittal, who comes with a background on the Hill. You can see his and all the other bios there in the Zoom, in the On24 bio section. And with that, Tom?
Thank you, Neil. And thanks to ACEEE for hosting this important session. Again, my name is Tom Dower with ArcelorMittal. I will describe the company for those who aren't familiar with us. We're the world's leading steel and mining company with about 190,000 employees in 60 countries, including industrial steelmaking operations in 18 countries. It's important to note as a company that we've been really working hard on a climate action plan. We put our first climate action plan out last year in 2019, where we committed to the Paris Agreement, specifically the net zero goal by 2050, which we came out with this year for all of our global operations. In Europe, where we have the bulk of our operations, we have set a 30% reduction goal by 2030, so very aggressive for a steelmaker. And we're pioneering breakthrough carbon neutral routes for steelmaking and iron making throughout the world. A lot of work in Europe in particular with a different policy environment. which we should all look to, both for the good parts and the bad, if you will. And we recognize that new policy frameworks will be required to ensure the transition to carbon neutrality is both competitive and technically possible. So I was going to talk a little bit about what is the reality in the manufacturing sector right now in very uncertain times and unprecedented times. So first of all, I just wanted to highlight, as many of us have noticed, that the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted how essential and how fragile manufacturing and supply chains really are. And we should retain those lessons as we look forward. Manufacturing is obviously a key employer in the U.S., both for, in economic terms, in human terms, and for national security purposes. And stakeholder expectations are very high and rising for manufacturing. We are all feeling it, and particularly around carbon and other sustainability topics. The United States has not had a coordinated, coherent climate strategy. Past legislative and regulatory approaches have focused heavily on a few sectors, transportation and power in particular, and many of us were involved in attempts to get at a sector-wide approach, and those didn't work 10 to 12 years ago. So we'll see where this conversation is heading. But there is, in that intervening time, there's been a lot more focus on the hard-to-abate industries that have those process-related emissions that are not easily electrified or found in other energy sources. So Neil's opening was key, that we're going to have a lot of work to do in some sectors that are just technically more difficult. So some of the challenges I'll focus on first for manufacturers. First of all, it's the pace and scope of change. We really do need to make tectonic shifts, paradigm changes in a relatively short time period. 30 years to 2050 may seem like a lot. There's a lot of focus on making improvements by 2030. That's 10 years. That's a lot shorter. And we're working in industries that have long investment cycles. And it's unclear right now whether the market will reward early movers, and that can require a leap of faith for those who want to make the right steps towards decarbonizing, but are in a market environment today that may not only reward, but you may be harmed economically vis-a-vis your competitors. There are also challenges for globally traded goods like steel, which argues for legislative and regulatory safeguards, such as carbon border adjustments or other mechanisms as we think about the policy options. It remains unspoken. We don't need to say it probably. There's loads of uncertainty. And uncertainty is not helpful in terms of leadership and making difficult decisions. There's a natural tension within the manufacturing sector, in my view, between recognizing the need to act, seeing the handwriting on the wall, seeing where markets are headed, et cetera, but skeptical of government-mandated solutions, more of the stick approach than the carrot approach. So I'm glad we're having a conversation that really is about all tools, legislative and regulatory. As the other challenge is the pendulum swing of politics and governing, and it's just difficult to make long-term decisions when such an important part of our business is impacted by government. So having a long-term vision about policy and trying to get it right, recognizing there will be tweaks along the way, is quite a challenge for all of us. On the other side of the coin are opportunities, and there are opportunities. The first one is really just being part of the solution to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and the importance of that can't be overstated. In addition, particularly materials and energy can lift people out of poverty and provide much higher quality of life around the world. Clean water, electricity, food, healthcare, you name it. Companies can also develop and deploy game-changing technologies with a potentially huge return on investment if you end up making the right ones. There's also a leadership opportunity for company and sector leaders that work towards solutions now, lower long-term business risk, retain the license to operate, which is continually under pressure, and drive the marketplace. And we can also identify synergies between industries for common technologies and infrastructure to reduce the cost for each individual participant. So those are important themes as well. Finally, I'll talk quickly about options for policymakers. Abigail already talked about this, but my recommendation after having spent many years in the Senate and now in the private sector is really working through what the specific barriers are to decarbonization by sector and which policies will work and which policies might not work. Providing some kind of incentive for early emissions reduction using existing technology, energy efficiency, of course, circular economy, many others that can be deployed right now at scale and give us some early wins. Finally, we can identify those common solutions and fund RD&D, really to get to the next generation. Remove barriers to large-scale infrastructure that will be needed by everyone. Pursue electrification for end uses wherever it's possible. And help establish a common set of language, metric, rules, regulations, et cetera, around low carbon materials and production. This conversation about Buy Clean and others, there's a lot of work to be done in that space. So I believe I am finished, and we'll turn it over to Neil to hand it to Ryan.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think it's very important to hear the voice of the industrial sector in these meetings. We've heard about industry, we've heard about Congress. I want to think about what can the new administration do, as was posed by Steve Nadel and some of the other speakers. So with that, introduce Ryan Fitzpatrick, who is with the Third Way and has been one of the leading organizations in the NGO community advocating for responsible policies. Ryan?
Hey, Neil, can you hear me all right?
Coming through.
Thanks to Neil and excellent. Thank you to Neil and to Lynn and the folks at ACEEE for having me. So as Neil said, I'm Ryan Fitzpatrick. I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Program at Third Way. And Third Way is a multi-issue think tank and advocacy group. The Climate and Energy Program is focused on getting the U.S. on the fastest and fairest path to net zero emissions by 2050, which is just pretty easy and straightforward. But one of the things that we realized a few years ago was that we were making progress on the power sector. We, of course, need to make more, and electrification is going to be a huge component of decarbonizing other sectors. But we really wanted to see more focus being placed on the industrial sector, as it's going to require a set of really bespoke solutions that are not going to be as easy or as possible to drive just with certain market conditions. So we, there are several groups that have been doing excellent work on this sector and raising more awareness about the need for policy solutions and helping develop those. A lot of those, as Abigail and Tom were talking about, a lot of those would be handled legislatively. A lot of these are going to require some pretty major investment levels, as well as some follow-on coordination that requires some new authority. But there are plenty of things that can be done with a willing administration or by a willing administration. That's what I wanted to focus on with you all today. So thinking about what a Biden-Harris administration might focus on when it comes to industrial decarbonization. Now, I will say I'm not speaking with any authority or advanced knowledge about what the Biden administration will do, but I've been hearing from folks who are much wiser than I am. The people who talk usually don't know, and the people who do know usually aren't talking. So don't want to pin them in here, but just to provide you a little insight on some of the things that the administration or that the campaign talked about when it comes to industrial emissions, and then give some ideas and general options for avenues that the administration could take. And I included a quote here just to show kind of the focus that the campaign put, not just on decarbonizing, not just on a stronger manufacturing sector, but marrying the two. So enacting a national strategy to develop a low carbon manufacturing sector in every state, accelerating cutting edge technologies and ensuring businesses and workers have access to new technologies and skills, with a major focus on helping small and large manufacturers upgrade their capabilities to have both competitive and low carbon futures. Covered a lot of ground in that one quote. And so maybe breaking that down just a little bit, talking about increasing competitiveness and onshoring of manufacturing jobs. That's something that the administration has expanded on when they're talking about a series of tax benefits and penalties that are designed to encourage domestic manufacturing, avoid inversions, to reshore American jobs, that type of thing. We're also talking here about leading in new and emerging clean energy industries. So that's something that the administration has talked about, having high quality middle class jobs by using some of these new industries to reinvigorate manufacturing. They've talked about a wide range of low carbon industries, but maybe the greatest or the most recurring emphasis gets placed on things like the auto industry, particularly manufacturing related to EVs and their supply chain. They've talked about, in the quote I mentioned before, and throughout the Biden campaign, climate and energy plan, they've talked about addressing equity issues while growing U.S. industry. So that includes things like family supporting wages and benefits, opportunities to organize, trying to advance the causes around environmental justice, and working to benefit traditional energy communities. So these are very important things. One thing the final focal point that I want to focus on for the majority of this talk here would be on reducing emissions from manufacturing, and there's plenty to say about that in particular. So we break this down into a few different categories. So standards and regulations, that's something that every administration has used, and it's something that I would expect the Biden administration to use, but use it thoughtfully and maybe be creative about how they can expand some of the assistance and capabilities they can provide through those techniques. Transparency in procurement. These are things, Abigail mentioned this a bit, Tom has mentioned some of this as well. Everybody likes transparency. We can't start solving a problem until we know the extent of it, and we can't find the opportunities until we can start quantifying where they are. So there are some opportunities there. Innovation and workforce development and international coordination. So on the standards and regulation side, this is something that, there are a few options. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act gives DOE explicit authority to set efficiency standards for mostly consumer goods, but some commercial and industrial items, things like electric motors and pumps, some heating equipment. But the Secretary does have some broader authority that would allow attempts to set standards for other equipment, maybe creating new product categories. That's something that could be explored to try and bring in more efficiency gains. And advisable to work with industry on that, of course, also with affected labor organizations. Another thing that we could see in a huge change of course from the Trump administration would be, as Trump was attempting to use rulemaking to make it harder for DOE to set standards and make incremental efficiency improvements, we would probably see a Biden administration return to the more standardized process for developing these types of efficiency regulations. I mentioned methane regulations here because on top of natural gas that produces electricity that gets used by industry, the industrial sector accounts for a third of natural gas consumption in the US. So gas is, of course, a major fuel and also feedstock for chemicals and fertilizers, other products. So any steps taken by the Biden administration to reduce upstream emissions from natural gas production or from pipelines, that would reduce the carbon footprint of one of the industrial sector's most prominent footprints. On transparency and procurement, so there are ways to encourage greater participation in voluntary efficiency programs. One would just be to acknowledge them and make them priorities and provide recognition for those who are participating. One that comes to mind would be the Better Plants program, which is part of the Better Buildings Initiative. So completely voluntary program, but providing technical assistance, budgeting guidance to help businesses prioritize their actions that produce major savings. But then also just giving federal recognition to these participants would be really helpful. The agency has promoted Better Plants, or at least talked about its wins as best as it could. But I think it has been probably constrained, just given that efficiency and related emissions reductions haven't always been a top priority of the administration. And so they've probably been a bit more hemmed in than they would be under the Biden administration. Also talking about gathering and standardizing emissions data from industry. So Abigail and Tom talked about some of this. The Federal Funding Transparency and Accountability Act already gives OMB and designated agencies the authority to collect all kinds of data from recipients of federal grants and contracts, subcontracts, into a single database. But it's not fully exercised. And in particular, it's not for gathering information on things like carbon intensity of inputs or embodied carbon. And a Biden administration could try to make better use of this authority, whether, even before they have additional legislation, perhaps. And then beginning to standardize things like life cycle analyses and other emissions data that are coming into various inventories. So agencies like EPA and DOT, Commerce with NIST, USDA, DOE, pretty wide swath. They all have incoming information through voluntary programs on how various industries are progressing in terms of emissions reduction, and where we're seeing gains, where we're seeing best practices. So it would be important to have some standardization of this information in order to start creating a consistent reporting mechanism, something like an environmental product declaration. And so, the Energy Policy Act, there might be some authority that's already in there that would give the Energy Information Administration, in particular, within DOE, the authority to start doing this kind of interagency coordination. So then, certifications and leading up to Buy Clean, the existing authority, it could be used to start developing the type of consolidated information gathering that would enable some initial certification programs, and eventually maybe even some labeling programs for consumers that at least acknowledge high-performing products. And while a full Buy Clean standard would require a more formalized authorization and working with Congress, particularly to have it to be mandatory for federal contracting purposes, this initial data gathering and harmonizing could really help expedite the setup of a formal program so that we're not starting cold. And it could give agencies a head start in prioritizing low carbon products in their procurement. So it doesn't replace legislation, but it really could help speed up the process. And that can't be understated in importance when we're talking about an issue like climate change, but also when we're talking about things like global competitiveness and having to deal with international requirements that are starting to spread in terms of trade and product quality, specifications around emissions. We want to be able to keep our options open in terms of global markets. So there are a couple of reasons why we want to be on top of this issue and not wait until we can find the perfect legislative solution to start doing some of the homework. Procurement was something the Biden campaign talked a lot about, and the Biden and Sanders Unity Task Force specifically calls out Buy Clean. So I would anticipate this to be a priority area for the Biden administration to be exploring early on. Innovation and workforce development. I put these two hand in hand because we want to make sure that we have the workforce training and skills for where the jobs are going, not just where the jobs currently are. And if we're working in a coordinated fashion with innovation, we can help make sure that we can foresee some of the changes in technologies and associated skills and labor needs that are going to be required. So, with innovation, the Biden campaign has been super bullish on clean energy innovation all across the board, so calling for $400 billion in investment over 10 years. They called out specific issues with manufacturing and industry when talking about energy innovation. So producing carbon-free hydrogen at the same cost as hydrogen from shale gas. We talked about that a minute ago. Decarbonizing industrial heat, production of steel, concrete, and chemicals, making carbon-neutral construction materials. So it's going beyond, even earlier on in the campaign, this was going beyond just a very general talking point of clean manufacturing. there's a detailed understanding from the Biden team about what goes into this and the technologies that are needed. So, so I think this would be, again, a strong area of focus for a Biden administration. Now, they might not be able to triple or quadruple investments without some help from Congress, but they can definitely move things in the right direction. So when we see things like changes in budget and appropriations, so one thing that comes to mind here would be the technology decarbonization roadmaps. And these are detailed technology pathways to get specific industrial subsectors on track with emissions reduction goals. And they're being put together by AMO to develop an agency-wide and interagency plans for RD&D and commercialization of technologies, getting emerging low-carbon manufacturing practices and processes adopted. This would help in the budgeting process, one, by just setting emissions reduction as a primary goal for federal investments, making that clear. Then also, avoiding duplication so that we can get more out of federal investments, and clearly identifying roles and responsibilities for different offices and agencies. These roadmaps they're required by Congress, so DOE will have to produce them sooner rather than later. But with Biden taking office, you could expect sooner. I would expect actually very soon. This will be a top priority to get these released and probably start building upon them and expanding them when they are, and possibly into additional industrial subsectors, and then also trying to maybe marry them with some of the workforce needs in other programs. So labs and institutes. The labs are obviously going to play a huge role in executing the RD&D strategy, and the Biden administration is very well aware of that. They specifically mentioned in the campaign plans investing in national laboratories. They specifically mentioned high-performance computing capabilities, but also regional innovation ecosystems that labs support. So one thing that comes to mind when the Biden administration can't necessarily snap its fingers and double an entire budget for DOE RD&D, let's say, but they could try to put more focus on things like lab-embedded entrepreneurship programs and accelerators that help startups take advantage of offerings at the labs and also carry on the work that the labs are doing into commercial capacities. So, the administration could push for even a marginal increase in funding, but also working with labs to ensure that each one is actually considering how they could use accelerators or entrepreneurship offerings and help them develop tailored programs. Some of the labs already have these programs. They run phenomenally well. More labs could be taking advantage of them. So the administration can work with appropriators to make sure that there's some funding that's specifically set aside for these purposes that maybe would go through Office of Technology Transfer or somewhere else in DOE, but that would be a good place to start. There are some other opportunities the Biden administration could try to build on, building on successful lab efforts. The manufacturing demonstration facility at Oak Ridge National Lab, for instance, has been hugely successful in moving manufacturing technologies closer to commercialization and establishing really great partnerships with industry and manufacturing community. So this is something that maybe the Advanced Manufacturing Office at DOE could partner with Oak Ridge to help other labs replicate using Oak Ridge's lessons learned and best practices. On manufacturing institutes, we could see the Biden administration push for an ongoing renewal of funding for manufacturing institutes, which tends to be in 5-year cycles. But I think what we would hope to see also is a more concerted effort to try and help labs become more self-sustaining, and especially once the economy is fully recovered. Other efforts around the institutes could be trying to direct more spending toward institutional colleges, and working on developing skills and expertise and human capital at 2-year colleges. One thing that's been brought up to us is the connection here with the incoming First Lady, Jill Biden, working closely with vocational schools, community colleges. It seems like a good fit for the administration, but there's definitely more coordination that can be done there. Moving to the next issue here. Apologies, I think it went one too far. Carbon capture, use, and storage. Abigail talked a bit about this, and it's also obviously important for the steel industry. This was something I wanted to flag just because, again, the Biden administration might not be able to have a 75% increase overall for CCUS budget lines, but they can start shifting more of the Office of Fossil Energy's priorities that are not specified by Congress to activities that are going to help with CCUS. And in particular, I would say increasing emphasis on applications for the industrial sector. So we've seen those carve-outs for industry projects start just a couple of years ago and growing bit by bit. This is something that we would hope to see more focus on, as opposed to the traditional expenditures that might be more geared toward coal-fired power plants. We do want to see more projects that would help expedite the adoption of CCUS by industry. So that is something that could be done without a huge lift from Congress. Eventually, we would want a huge lift from Congress. We'd want to have a lot more in terms of demonstration projects, but this is something the Biden administration could do right away. And then technical assistance and training, we talked a little bit about this, but there are, Sorry?
We need to wrap up.
Oh, sorry. So we'll skip past this one. And then last spot here would just be international coordination. We have the Paris Agreement, of course, but also working on the Montreal Protocol. We might see Congress move on HFCs, but that would be something the Biden administration could re-enter into negotiations and try to put more emphasis on global activity there, working with organizations like the United Nations Industrial Development Organization to try and advance U.S. interests. We've been checked out of that for the past administration, and then bringing some of these priorities into trade negotiations. And I will wrap there. Sorry about that, Neil.
Not to worry. Thank you so much, Ryan, and appreciate the presentations from all of the speakers. We're going to move over to the Q&A now. And just to remind people, if you will click down at the bottom, there should be a link that should take you to the Zoom room, and you will join our three presenters there. I've got a couple of questions that came in, but please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screen when you get over to Zoom, and we will see you over there momentarily.